Hi, my name is Patricia Dobbins. I'm an environment artist that specializes in stylized art. I'm doing a breakdown video of my project for Stylized Station. What I hope for you guys to learn from this is how to approach a stylized prop in 5 steps. I would love to give a shout out to Stylized Station for this opportunity. So in this breakdown video, I'm going to explain how I went from this concept art to my final look of my project. I did this in 5 steps, step 1 being prep work and block out, step 2 being high-res model, which was done in ZBrush, step 3 being my game res model and UVing, step 4 was texturing, which was done in Substance Painter, and step 5 is my presentation and publishing it on social media. This was done in Sketchfab, Photoshop, and ArtStation. So, the first step in prep work is to find concept art that you gravitate to, since you are going to be working on this for days or even weeks. I was really gravitated towards this after my friend sent me this through Stylized Station's Instagram page. They were showcasing this wonderful concept artist. His art station is going to be shown right now, as well as linked below. I don't want to butcher his name, but please check him out. You might even find your next, inspiration there. The next thing you want to do is picking a style, and the reason why you want to pick the style is because it influences everything in your project, and knowing what style you plan on doing will save you tons of times. It will help you with your reference search, it will help you with your modeling, your high-res modeling, your texturing, as well as your presentation shot. So in here I show you reference from Overwatch and Darksiders. They are both stylized, but they are not at all the same. So in this case, the reason why I do this is because I see this so many times, and I've had this problem as well, is I don't think of a style that I want to do, so I start modeling, start doing my high res, start texturing. Halfway through my texturing I say, I really wanted to do it in this style, and I have to restart my entire project, or you're gonna have to restart your entire project. So this is something you just want to do before you even start modeling, and you want to do before you start collecting your references, so you can start collecting your references for it. In this case, I ended up just doing the style in the way that I saw in the concept. I didn't want to do it based off of any game or game studio, so I didn't have to do any research on style besides the references of this part. So in this part, the references I ended up picking was wooden bookcases and closets that were very, very old and worn down. I also ended up picking up reference for helmets and swords that were in the same color range as my sword and helmet on the concept art. This was just to give me a clear idea of how, metal looks, as well as getting the correct type of bends to the metal. And the wood texturing was a great help having these on hand. The reason why is I could see that the edges were worn down, as well as seeing that there was a variation between the roughness on old wood cases, or wood bookcase, and closets. So after this, I also looked up some YouTube tutorials on stylized wood and metal, just so I could see how other people approach projects that were similar to mine, as well as learning and getting to learn a lot more on stylized work. Every person does stylize a little bit different. There is no wrong or right way of approaching a stylized look, but it is good to learn from other people. You may find something that's quicker for you and, does a lot more to your project in less steps. In this case, looking up YouTube tutorials from these people were great. I got a lot of influences from them, and they will be linked down below as well. The next step is completely optional, and that is splitting my project into groups. It keeps myself organized, as well as helps me know what I need to work on and what is done. In this case, I split it up in 3 groups: my metal group, my wood group, and my prop group. After that, I ended up creating a folder which had my project name, which was Closet of a Young Warrior, and in this I created subfolders for my Maya files, my ZBrush files, my OBJs from ZBrush, my FBXs from Maya, my Substance Painter files, my texturing from Substance Painter, my render files, and my reference files. After setting up my folders, the next thing I do is my blockout. So my blockout is mainly focusing on proportion, spacing, and overall getting everything blocked out in my scene. In this case, I had a fabulous concept artist who ended up actually making alternatives designs to his closet before he finally decided on this one. And here he has a incredible front view that helped me have the basic shapes of everything for my closet. I wasn't really focused on, the flag or, the sword or even what was in the middle. I was just trying to get the basic shapes of my closet down. Another tip that I would recommend for you guys who are modeling, are a little bit, hesitant on trying new things for modeling, because I was, think of everything in this scene as shapes, like basic shapes. Rectangles, cylinders, squares, planes. I literally made a plane of this and then I just extruded it out. So in this case, I can show you an example. Some people feel, oh, I need to model this all in one piece. You don't have to model your helmet all in one piece. You can actually just take a sphere, cut it in half, get a cylinder, or in this case, I ended up taking a pipe, extrude one of the faces out. There you go. There, you have a helmet after you smash those pieces together. Modeling doesn't have to be something where, you only have to model from one square. You can build off of your shapes. So in this case, everything is modeled into pieces, and it helps you look at a project in pieces than looking at it as an overall look. The reason why I would recommend doing this for people who are trying out a new modeling The reason why I would recommend doing this is because it can actually end up helping you in the long run when you have a more, daunting piece and you don't know how to go about it. Look at it in shapes, look at it in simple shapes, and build off of that first. And once you get everything together, I'll start to slowly look like it, and you can then, think, oh, maybe I should extrude a face there, move the, the verts a little bit, and I'll help you out. The next thing I would recommend you guys to do after doing your block out, and even before you even touch the bevel tool, is to get a critique from other artists. This could be done in Facebook groups, Discord groups, any social media. You can even get it from your friends and family who hasn't even touched, a piece of paper in their life to draw anything. The reason why is because sometimes, you don't see something in a project because, you're so occupied and, you're thinking a billion steps ahead, and you don't want to get to the texturing phase and see, oh, that's not how that's supposed to look. It looks completely off. Now I'm looking at it. Now I got to go back and fix it, fix my UVs, fix whatever high res I did, and then now fix my texturing phase. To avoid doing that and avoid, wasting so much time, it's good to get critiques from other artists on the project that you're doing at each iteration of your project. So in this case, I always do it block out, high res, midway point of my texturing to make sure that I'm going in the right direction, and before I present. So I usually do that with my lab instructors who are constantly on Discord. I either do that on the Discord groups, some great links down below I'll be posting. Other places are Facebook groups. They have great communities there, and there's always going to be someone online who is prepared to look at your work and help you out. So after finishing up my final block out, which is right here, the next thing I do is my beveling. Here you can see quite a difference between my block out and my beveled model. I actually did nothing but bevel some parts of this. I do not feel like I needed to bevel everything I had in my scene. Like my sword isn't beveled, the ink pot isn't beveled, and the belt isn't beveled at all. So in some cases, yes, beveling is needed, like in these areas, but in some cases beveling is not needed. So you just have to figure out for your project how it is. In my case, I knew what needed to be bevel, and also beveling does help me sculpt, since it does give me an area where I can create a worn look to the bookcase. So after beveling, I also soften and harden the edges. You can look up tutorials of why it is very, very necessary for you to soften and harden your edges. I would recommend you guys to look into that, but I can just quickly explain quite the huge difference between it. So here I'm just going to grab this and then I'm going to harden my edges. When you bevel something, your edges or your bevels are going to look like this. Softening your bevels or your edges will have this effect on it. After that, I look over my model one more time, save the scene. In this case, I named it Game Res because I ended up actually using this as my Game Res, changing a little bit of things, but I will explain that in part 3, which is the Game Res and Low Res part, as well as UVing. So after checking to see everything is done and after checking my checklist and crossing out everything that I finished, I moved on to essentially preparing my project to go into ZBrush. So the only thing that I really added to the scene that wasn't there beforehand was the flag, and the reason why it's super dense is because I ended up using the soften tool to push this into the bookcase to lay almost naturally. So after adding in the flag, the next step I do is square off my project, specifically the wood and metal group. The reason why I do this is because I feel like it's a lot easier for me to work with the project if it's squared, especially in ZBrush, since I don't like really subdividing or dynameshing my projects. Also, this is essentially how ZBrush works. It does try to square your project as much as it can. So this is what I do. I was taught this in school, and it makes me feel a lot more comfortable working in ZBrush like this. So what I did next was essentially export my wood group, my metal group, and my prop group. If you see here, I do have my project group, and then I have it separated. So the bookcase, I later on ended up separating this in ZBrush, but right now it's just included, and I also included the flag pole to this bookcase wooden part. The reason why I did this, even though I usually have this separate, is because of the fact that the shape of this flag is very much influenced by the bookcase, and it has to lay naturally on this. So when I'm creating the wrinkles to it, like is shown in the concept, I want to make sure that it also works with the model that it's laying on. And then after that, I exported the props out and I put it into a folder specifically named, where I put my bookcase, this group, as bookcase prepared ZBrush and the prop prepared ZBrush. And now I am ready to go into ZBrush and start sculpting. So this is step 2 of my project, and this is creating my high res, which is going to be done in ZBrush. So the first thing I'm going to explain in this project is the information that I learned and how I approached this. So my first concern was focusing the most on my bookcase and trying to get those engravings as close as I could to the concept. So here you can see that I have a lot of these indents or engravings in the wood. It's mostly swirls. They have a organic feel to it, so it's not just a straight line. It actually feels as though it's part of the feel of the project. So I spent most of my time looking at that and trying to figure out how to achieve that look without having to model it into a high-res model, or just, straight up creating this in Substance Painter. But I was able to achieve it in ZBrush after like 2 failed attempts, and the 2 failed attempts were modeling it in the high-res model of Maya, and then I brought it in, just looked awful. Didn't even touch my project for a week after that happened. I took a breath, went back to my project, and tried a new method, which was masking the area out. So if you see, I ended up masking. So I'm going to turn off these so we can just focus on my bookcase. So here I thought it'd be a brilliant idea to mask this out, change it, go to the move, and push it inwards, and as you can see, it created a lot of problems. I worked on that for around a week, and after seeing no progress done, I decided to take a break and work on my other portfolio project that was due for school. And actually working on that project gave me a ton of insight of how to work on this project, because I ended up working with a wooden beam that was stylized, and one of my lab instructors actually sent me a tutorial on how to achieve that wooden beam look to it. And it was more of a traditional wooden texture, it was just stylized, but seeing the brushes that they used and seeing the techniques that they were using on that project helped me realize what I needed to do. So in this case, I will be explaining it to you. So what I did to achieve this look was I first went to the stroke, went to lazy mouse and turned it on. So right now the radius is at 1, but it was at 20 when I started working on this. And I alternated between 2 brushes. I used the Orb Cracks, and this is from the Orb brush pack. It is free and it is online, and I would recommend anyone, no matter what type of art style you lean towards or work with, to download these. These are amazing, and they have a variety of brushes and effects that it can do on your project. So I will link that down below so you'll be able to find it. Give a huge thanks to the person who created them. I will also be linking that person down below. So I use the Damn Standard brush as well as the Orb's Crack brush to achieve the engravings on the wood. For the smaller details that would focus a lot more on having a more spiral look to it, I use the Orbs brush, and to achieve the more deeper engraved look to it, I actually used the Damn Standard brush, where I changed it from dots, which is the default, to the freehand, and changed the alpha from alpha 01, I believe it is, to alpha 28. This is a square. That's what I needed to achieve that look right here, that look right here, and that look right here, as well as this area. So something that I would recommend anyone to do while working on a ZBrush sculpt is to become more comfortable in changing your alpha and changing the stroke, changing the intensity, the draw size as frequently as possible to try to achieve different types of looks for your projects. I am one of those people where I did not do that, and I would always wonder why my project looked slightly off from whatever I was trying to work on, and I just needed to get more comfortable with changing my settings. The great thing about ZBrush is if you want to go back to your original default settings, all you have to do is reset all brushes and they'll just set it back to how it was originally. So there is absolutely no reason for you to be afraid of you losing the original way that your brushes looked. There is always going to be a button that works no matter what, unless you are somehow able to somehow mess up ZBrush where it just never goes back to their default brush, but that would be a sight to see. But in this case, what I did was I looked at my reference and I worked on a tablet. So currently I'm working on a mouse. So when I show you some of the details that I added, if you see any weird looks to it, it's because I am using a mouse. But with my tablet pen, what I did was I went over the concept art here and I just drew with my pen on top the shape of it, so, or the stroke of it. And what I did was I snapped it to a face that I would be able to see, and I just took my pen and did a stroke. So for this, I would recommend creating layers and saving as frequently as possible when you're creating details, because, you know, maybe I get this stroke to look perfect, but this one looks a little bit wonky. If you don't have layers or you don't have previous saves, you would then have to delete this, bring in a new one that looks like this, and start working on that, and it's just too much time. It's better to just stop recording, delete the layer, and then restart again than having to go through the process of appending a subtool to your project. So again, I just practiced the strokes and had it flickered out. So here I'll just show you again. I changed the intensity, so usually intensity is a little bit higher, but in this case I wanted to be able to get that look. So Again, it's just a mouse. I'm using my trackpad, but I just practiced the strokes. I made sure to be recording while working on the projects to get the look that I wanted. And I just kept practicing it. And then after I was happy with how it looked, I moved on to the next part, which was the door. And I took an orbs brush because it's easier to get that tapered look at the end. And I just practiced. And I changed the orbs cracked look. So this one is the one that I use. I changed the intensity, I changed the focal shift, and I changed the draw size. Constantly trying to find a sweet spot that I really liked. And then once I found it, I used that brush and I just used my memory of the stroke to achieve the look that I was trying to get. Constantly mess around with your lazy mouse settings. Because you might be able to find something that works for you. In this case, since the tutorial that I watched helped me a lot with the wood texturing, I kept it at 20. And that is honestly how I was able to achieve these wood texture look. So like I mentioned beforehand, the more squared look of the engravings was done in Dam Standard with the alpha that was squared with a softened look, and then more of the tighter tapered out edges where it was more going inwards like a V was done with the orbs brush. And I just alternated between those brushes and worked with layers on and off to make sure that I was getting that look that I was trying to achieve, and it worked very well. A thing that I would recommend for you guys to do is, if you see I have my project in pieces, which really did help a lot when working on one piece at a time. So what I just did was I went into polygroups. Since I did export this in combined, all you really have to do is just go to polygroups and auto group, and it will auto group it automatically for you into the pieces, almost as though it was in the outliner of like Maya if it was just in a group. And if I wanted to just focus on this piece right here, all I would do is Command Shift F. This is on the Mac, by the way, and then I would be able to just focus on this piece and get the look that I was going for. So that is how I did my look of the wood, and now I will be explaining how I did my edges. Before beginning on that, I would like to mention how I was able to get this look right here. So if you look here, specifically this line right here, you see that it stops right before it hits this area right here towards the sword, so it wouldn't take away from this area. The way that I was able to do that was I just marked off where this piece starts. So like the corner piece that would go right here, I just marked it very faintly here. You can even see it if you look close enough, but I just marked it faintly. So when I was working with this brush, I just stopped at that area. I went a little bit forward since I knew that the metal piece would be covering it, and just smooth out the edges, and that worked out. That's honestly all I did. I marked out areas again. A thing you can just do is create a layer, call it markup, and mark those areas that you have. And then once you're done creating the outlines of the engravings, you delete that marked up layer and it's all clean again. The next the next tool that I ended up working on was the flag. The flag was pretty simple. In this case, I didn't want to waste geometry on getting this piece right here, which you can see right there. In Maya, since I knew that I could be able to bake that down, so what I just did is I ended up taking my masking tool, and I just masked out this area as well as this area, went down to the deformation, went to inflate, I inflated it, and that was about it. Nothing too fancy. The next thing I did was do the wrinkles. In this case, I went to brushes. I went to brushes and did the inflate tool, changed from the dots to freehand, lowered this, and then just added that. So I'll fix that later, don't worry. Well, I'm not going to be using this anyways. So you see how intense it is? I ended up just lowering the intensity, try it again, see, okay, that's a little bit too thick, let me change the draw size. Okay, that is what I want to get for. So after I add that, you're like, is that all you do? Well, no. So the next thing I did was I smoothed out this area right over here where the inflated part meets the actual model. So I wanted to add a smooth transition between that, so I just smoothed it out. In this case, I actually did up my intensity for my smooth brush a lot so I could be able to get that transition to look right. So I just did it with the edge, looked at the rest of my project, smoothed any other details out, saw that, and also add a little bit more to this area right here, and saw, okay, that looks good. Yeah, that's how I want it to look. So I am now ready to show you how I did the edge, oh wow, how I did my edge damage. Again, I am doing this in a mouse, so if some of the way that my tools look while I'm trying to show you looks off, it's because I'm using a mouse. So here I'm just going to hide my engravings so you could focus on just the edges, and here you have a great tool if you want to in the layers to just turn off the eye, which is gonna turn off the visibility of that, so you can see quite the difference it made. But here you can see how much of the model is affected by the damaged wood. A big thing I would tell you that I had to do a lot was to make these edge damages a lot more noticeable from a distance. I have a tendency to add, like I mentioned before, I have a tendency to go a lot smaller than larger. So in this case, I had to make the damages on the edges a little bit bigger so you would be able to see it from a distance and to give it more of a stylized look. Another thing I also had to do while working on this project is constantly look at the reference to see where the chips are. So you see a chip here, a bigger damage here, somewhat of damage here. Since this is kind of blurred for me, I just assumed there was a bit of a damage there. Damage right over here, damage here, a bit of damage over here, and some worn out edges here. So in here, all I did was alternate between 3 brushes. The 3 brushes was Trim Dynamic, Trim Adaptive, and Trim, or not Trim, but Orbs Flatten Brush, that's slash. There we go. You think it would be OF, but it's not. So here, I started off first with what I started off with was my Trim Dynamic brush. And what I did was up the size, and I'll turn this layer on so I can show you how I did it. And I just went in, probably changed the size a little bit more, and this is where you just need to experiment. Don't forget you have the ability to Command Z. So use that as often as you can. Just come in here, add a little bit of edge damage, and there we go. Although, when I'm looking at my wood references, wood doesn't react like this. It doesn't just have these jagged edges towards it. So the next thing I did was go to my Orbs Flatten brush, and that was T, and went in here, or more or less kind of smoothed that area out a bit to get that smooth, worn look that wood is known for. Because when you look at it, wood doesn't necessarily like crack and then like chip off like rocks do. They get worn out over time, especially around the edges. So when you look at a worn out table, the edges are rounded, then staying sharp and having like a chip. So for me, my goal was to get that worn out look towards it. Another thing you can also do to clean up those areas is just smooth it out. I have a tendency to have my smooth brush like down to like 12 and work with that. So you just have to rotate and make sure that you're getting areas, and make sure when you're sculpting that you're looking at it from any type of angle that you're working in. So Sometimes you might have to look here and be like, that looks nothing like it does right over here. So sometimes you just have to just rotate around, and if you see something, fix it or smooth it out or work with that area. So that is what I did. To get those bigger chunks of pieces of the wood or indents, what I used was the trim adaptive. This one was a bit more tricky to do with a mouse, so I would recommend using a tablet and pen. But for me, all I really did was just go in here and go back and forth and then go up and down a little bit. I changed the intensity of it so it wasn't so harsh, and I just tried to get a natural look to it. I smoothed it out a lot, and you can see then having like almost a squared chip, it does round out, and you just keep building off of it. So I went all around the model, and I went behind the model as well and added those edge damage. So if I turn this on, you'll see the edge damage that will pop up on the back. So you can see right over here, I added that edge damage to the back because I knew that this was going to be viewed at all angles, so I wanted to cover my bases. So that is officially how I did the edge damage. I used 3 brushes, I changed the intensity, I changed the draw size, and I just build off of that. So if you want, what you can do is, what I usually do is I take my trim dynamic. So I'll take my trim dynamic, do all the basic edging, worn out edge, and then after that, after I make sure to see, yeah, I like how those edges look, I go back with the Orbs Flatten brush, and I just smooth those areas out. Any places that still have those kind of damaged look to it, or more of like a rocky look to it, what I do is I just smooth out with a very low intensity, so 12 to 6 usually works for me. And then after that, for the bigger chunks that I see around here and here, I just take a trim adaptive brush, change the intensity, and I build with that little pieces, smooth it out, see how it looks, and then do it again and again and again until I'm satisfied with it. I would recommend keeping those layers on separate, so maybe you look back and you're like, maybe I shouldn't have made that trim dynamic brush as intense as it was, so you can just come into the layers and change the intensity of it. So my tip while working on building a worn out look to your project is to create layers for each of the brushes that you use, and that's why I say usually try to work with one brush during the whole session on the project and then another and another, is because let's say that you think that or let's just say for example that I thought that I did my trim dynamic brush effect a little bit too harsh. I can go in here and change the intensity of how it looks. So in this case, I was very happy with how my edged look. I got critiques on it, I got critiques on my wood engravings, and now it was on to the metal look, which was super easy. Not gonna lie, I honestly just did the edge damage to it. So for the metal look, I did not use the Orbs Flatten Edge or the Orbs or the Trim Adaptive brush. I only used the Trim Dynamic brush because I wanted to be able to achieve that rough, like that more rough, sharp, worn out look to the project. So that is what I did. I just went across the entire metal edging and just added some bigger chips in some areas, but just literally took my brush, cranked up the lazy radius for the stroke, and just went straight across it, up, and then that's it. That was all I had to really do. The last part that I did was the props. In this case, there wasn't a lot that I really needed to do to this. My main focus was the sword, the helmet, the armor piece, and the wood block holding up the sword. So for the sword, at least, let's start with that. I honestly didn't do anything with it. Since it needed to be sharp, I didn't soften or harden any edges over there. I just added the 2 holes that were here, and as you noticed beforehand, it is here, here, and here. So I'll just quickly explain what I did. What I just did is took a standard brush, I changed it to freehand, clicked option. I'm on Mac, by the way. I clicked option, and then I just, well, I need to make it smaller, so I'm going to make it like that. Took option, just drew, and it just inverts the brush. So then going like this, I'll go like this. And after that, I kind of just take a smooth brush, soften it a little bit, and now it has the look of the holes in it. I did that, so I wouldn't need to draw that in Sketchfab. Or not Sketchfab, but Substance Painter. I just want to be able to use the curvature map and AO for that part. So after that, my main focus was getting these scribes in there, and all I really did was looked at how this looked, made straight lines, and then took my move brush, made it very, very soft, and just pushed some of these edges away. And that's all I really did for this part right here. For the wrap, it was fairly easy. I just took a damn standard brush and swiped over it around the curve, and it worked out fine. Nothing too fancy for that. I wasn't trying to spend too much time on that part. The next part that I needed to work on was the bookcase. I added this deep end towards it. It looks better in Substance Painter right now. It's just doing that weird thing, but I never had that problem in Substance Painter, but it always gave me that look in ZBrush. After that, I kind of just rounded out some of the edges to the belt. Most of the details of the belt will be coming from Substance Painter. The next part that I mainly focused on was the helmet. In this case, since I saw in the helmet, if you see over here, there is a dent, there is a scratch, a hole, and a scratch. Orb's brush has great scratches that you can use. They're called slashes. And here, I just went and dragged the detail out. So let me, right there. So all I did was take it, dragged it out, and you'll have it there. Sometimes it won't come out on the first time. You'll just have to change the brush and find an angle where it'll pop out, like there. It'll come out, but it won't hit that edge, so sometimes you have to go at like an angle for it. But you'll just have to try out the different brushes that they have there. That's what I did to get this one, the skinnier one and the more deeper cut one. I added, I just took my trim adaptive brush to create that little dent there, and then I took the mallet brush to create that there. I just ended up taking my smoothing brush and going around the edges to create that transition so there's not a harsh line, similar to how I did my cloth. So after this, after I'm completely done sculpting, after I bake down my layers, which you're supposed to do once you're done with layers, once you know that that is how you want your project to look, bake down your layers before you do anything else. And the next thing you want to do is go into Z plugin, pre-process your current model, and once that is complete, and it will show you that it's complete right here, you will go here and decimate current. The reason why I do this is because I need to bring this into Maya to check and compare it to my game res model and change anything if there's a huge drastic change between my game res model and my sculpt. Thankfully, I did not really have that much problems with my game res. I actually virtually had to change nothing to it. So in this case, I ended up using my decimated version for Substance Painter for my high res. So I decimate current. It went from 30 million active points to I think 1.6 million. So the way I did that was decimated it. Once I was done, I went to export, and it will export just the one subtool, and it's going to take a while. So here it is. Then I went to my SPA or SP high, which I knew that it was going to be used for Substance Painter. And here you can see I had bookcase high, so I just name it that, and it will become an OBJ. Keep it as an OBJ. That is what you're going to be using for your high res model when you're baking down your textures in Substance Painter. I always do mesh by name. So when I bake, it will acknowledge the naming convention over the actual position of the model. This, I feel, is a lot better when you're baking props and you're baking down the high res onto your low res. It just helps you keep things organized as well as knowing where everything is. So just kept it in the same groups. I ended up separating my metal rod and my flag from each other, and that is all. I am done with the high res, and now I am ready to continue on to my next step, which is step 3, and that is the game res and UVing process. So this is now step 3 of my project, which is creating my game res / low res model and UVing the model. So this is going to be a fairly short video since I'm not doing a tutorial, I am doing a breakdown of it. So I'm just going to quickly go through the steps of what I did and the tips I would recommend for you guys to do. So here I brought in my decimated model from ZBrush into my scene here, which is my UV clean. This is going to be my final scene that I did. So in the modeling phase, I actually was able to get away with just using my beveled project before I started working in ZBrush because I didn't do any major silhouette changes. So what I did was I made sure to check that everything was aligned with my high res and my game res and so I am just going to bring in my flag high res just to show you what I mean by checking to see any major silhouette changes. So in this case, I did add this clasps, these two clasps and these wrinkles. So in this case, you can kind of look at it and be like, well, Patricia, this kind of looks like there is a major change. You don't really see this on your low res or your game res. And in this case, I would say baking has gone pretty far, especially in Substance Painter, and from past experience, wrinkles, especially more like organic shapes, you can get away with a lot of stuff. You don't have to have it exactly on top of each other and, you know, have everything look fine. I knew that with this much of a difference between these models, I could be able to bake it without changing anything from the actual original game res piece. So I brought it in, made sure to look at every angle of my project to see if there was anything that was sticking out or any major silhouette changes. I did not see any of that, so I was able to give the okay and check off my game res for my bookcase. The next thing I did was check the metal, so I ended up deleting the high res from the scene, brought in my metal group from ZBrush, made sure that everything was aligned correctly, made sure that anything, that there wasn't any weird silhouette changes. That was fine, so I gave it the okay, checked it off. The next step is preparing for UVing. For this, all I do is I delete any unused edges that I don't need, and then the next thing I did was delete any unseen faces in my project. So here, an example of this is this metal piece. You see, you aren't going to see the inside of this metal piece, so I deleted it because it saves on UV space as well as saving on poly count. The next step is UVing, and here you can see that I filled up my 0 to 1 space more than 85%. I would recommend you guys to do this since this is me trying to make sure that I do a quote game optimized prop, and in games you try to use up as much space as you can on your 0 to 1 because, you know, textures are very expensive while working on a game. So here I made sure that I checked the textile density as frequently as possible for each group and made sure that they were exactly the same. The only ones that I upped up was the props, since I wanted to make sure that there wasn't any pixelation happening in my project. So what I did, I'm just going to give you a step of how I did it, was I grabbed my bookcase, I just grabbed the project or the piece, and then I went to automatic and it laid it out for me. Another thing I would tell you to do beforehand, which I forgot to mention, was make sure that you soften and harden your edges before you even start UVing. That will very much determine how you will cut and sew your UV shells. So after hardening and softening my edges, I took a piece of my group, did an automatic layout for it, and then I just grabbed this piece and moved it over. The next thing I did was focus on the props. The props were the most time-consuming part of this whole entire project for UVing. Mostly because of the fact that I had so many tiny details here. I had to make sure that I had all of this looking correct. I had to actually manually go in and sew and cut the pieces and actually do a camera base. I had to make sure that this part right here for the books were laid out correctly. I had to make sure that I unitized this piece right here to make sure that there wasn't any distortion. So the tools that I mostly used in this project for UVing was the modify tab, which was the unitize to be able to get that clean look on the UVs so it wasn't distorted or having any funky look to it. The next one I did for tools was the smooth tool. This is similar to the unfold. I just feel like I have a little bit more control on how much I can unfold or smooth out my UVs. The next thing that I used in the UV toolkit was the textile density settings, where I would be able to just get a textile density of one of these shells. So in this case, I just got this one, and I used this base, the textile density as the base for the rest of my project before I laid it out to make sure that I had everything in the same resolution. After doing that, I usually use the Create for the automatic camera base and planer. I feel like those are the easiest ones to use. It's nothing too crazy. After that, I use the Unfold tab for Optimize and Unfold. This just helped mostly with the more rectangular shape, so it helped with the bookcase, it helped with the flag, and it helped with the scrolls. So after showing you the tools that I used for this project, I separated each section. So these are my bookcase, my metal, and my prop group. And all I did was grab everything, went to the layout UV, and you can see here it did a pretty good job of laying out my UVs. It used as much space as possible. It did more than 85% of the area, so I would count that as a win. The only complaint that I would give is that I really don't know where a lot of the pieces are, and this is just personally for me. I like to keep my UV shells with my groups in certain areas. So as you see in the original, I have my bookcase area here, and I know exactly where the pieces are. I have my prop groups in between the areas that I could squeeze it in, and for my metal group, they are all sectioned off in areas, so they're not like wildly everywhere. They're here and here. So this part is not required. I think that the layout is pretty well for what I did, for the one that I used as an example, but for me personally, like I mentioned a billion times beforehand, I love to keep myself organized. So in this case, I wanted to make sure that everything was grouped together, and this also did help me while texturing. The next step I would recommend you to do, and something I mentioned beforehand, is remembering what you mirrored over. So in this case, I remember that I mirrored this piece. I remember that I mirrored one of these legs. I remember I mirrored this, and I remember that I mirrored the metal part right here. When UVing and you know that you mirrored something over, and you know that you have one piece correctly done, and now you gotta go with the second one, and you forgot how you do your steps, all you have to do is click on this, or let me show it on this one. Click on this, go to Mesh, and transfer attributes. This will literally save you so much time if you have pieces that are duplicates or mirrored over on the other side. honestly, all you have to do is just transfer the UV attributes over, and you don't have to worry about that anymore. But for pieces where you would want to stack them on top of each other, what you can do in this case is just for this piece right here, you can see that I have it in the 0 to 1 space, but this piece right here, I actually moved over to the other side. Ignore that part right there, but I did move it over on the other side, so all I have to do is grab this. I know that those shells right there are here, so all I have to do is grab this, go all the way to the move, make sure it's at 1, and just click this button over, and it will be in the exact same position as you see here. It's just in this area right now. So I would recommend you to do this. Actually, I wouldn't recommend you to do this. This is something you're going to have to do because in Substance Painter, I haven't found a workaround of this, but if you try to stack UVs in Substance Painter, you will not be able to paint on it. It just doesn't recognize which shell it is. So to make it easier on you, just move the one of the shells over if you plan on having one side or just one side texture and having the exact same thing mirrored over. After you do that, after you finish your texturing, you can go back to your game res model that you did, and all you have to do is just grab those pieces, move it over again to the 0 to 1 space, use whatever renderer you're using, and it will recognize both sides. It won't do the weird Substance Painter thing where it just won't paint on anything. It will recognize it and it will apply the textures on both sides. After I'm done UVing, I make sure I grab it one more time. I look through everything to make sure that nothing is overlapping. I don't see anything overlapping. I make sure that if there's any space available, I move it over. But I see that there is no real overlapping on this project. Another thing that I did that you are more than welcome to do is, since I knew that with this flag, and you can see it here, I knew with this flag the main focus was going to be the front part, I went behind, grabbed this UV shell, and just sized it down. And this is to create more space within my 0 to 1 space. You're more than welcome to do this. I did not want to delete this face right here because if you rotate it enough, you are going to need to see that face right there. So that is all I did. Nothing too crazy. You can do this with the rest of the pieces. I think I also did it with the back piece over here, and then some of the pieces over here. I knew that I was going to keep them here, and they are very noticeable, so I just made sure to keep that there. So after I was done UVing, I went back to my Maya standard, and I started naming everything. So if you remember the naming convention that I did in ZBrush, it is the exact same way that I did it here. The only difference is then having a underscore high. I have an underscore low. The reason why I did this is because in Substance Painter, I knew I was going to bake by mesh name. Tips that I would recommend you to do if you are struggling with UVing is look up tons of tutorials. There are in-depth tutorials on UVing. There's in-depth tutorials on layouts, the way the tools work, as well as doing and figuring out your textile density. Another thing I would recommend you to do is something that my teachers did for us was give us a model that we didn't have to texture, we didn't have to model. They just gave us a model and they told us UV it, and we would UV it, and we would get graded on the UVs. I think that's a great way to learn how to UV. So those are some tips I would recommend for you to do if you are not confident in UVing. So after that, after naming my groups, the next thing I did was export it. All I did was just grab this, went to File, Export, found the file or folder that I have in my hard drive and my Closet of a Young Warrior folder, made sure that I named it Bookcase Low or Closet Low, and then I was prepared to go into Substance Painter. So now I am ready to start step 4 of my project, which is texturing. I did my texturing in Substance Painter, as you can tell here. And some points that I would like to make before I start texturing is more or less my mindset before I started working on this and the way that I went on texturing this. So I have my concept art right here. And the first thing I noticed while I was working on this project is that my textures are, or the material and the color of my concept is influenced a lot by the lighting. So here you can see that there's a gradient occurring from here to here. There's a gradient occurring here to here, here to here, as well as from here to here. This one mostly because of the shadow, but you can clearly see it from this area right here. Where I can pull that up a little bit more, you can see how it goes from this brown tan color to this yellow brown color. So my goal in this is to replicate the gradients that would be affected by the light because it's being caused by the light, and essentially just putting that down onto my textures. The reason why is because I knew that I would be working in Sketchfab, and Sketchfab has a pretty limited setup for their lights. It's not like Marmoset or Unreal or Maya where you'll be able to go into the nitty-gritties of the lights that you set up and being able to have an effect in certain areas. Sketchfab is overall user-friendly, so they try to make it as simple as possible for you to set up your lighting there. So in this case, I knew that I wanted to be able to have this gradient look coming from here to here, here to here, and here to here, as well as these different tones and hues of the materials on my textures and not rely so much on my lighting. So for my lighting, my main focus was getting the warm tone here, the blue light here, and the warmer color light that's coming here and hitting this area and this area here. I explained that a lot more in step 5, which is my presentation shot and my final publishing. But for now, I'm going to be mentioning it just so you guys know why I decided to approach my project the way I did. Again, this is not really a tutorial, it is a breakdown, so I won't be going too much in details of each layer that I do, but I will explain the setup for each one. Another thing I would like to mention is I got a lot of influence from a lot of stylized artists out there for my textures. So I looked up a ton of YouTube videos on texturing for metal and wood, specifically for stylized. And one great artist that I found is the person who runs 3DEX. I followed his stylized material tutorial for some parts of it. Some parts just did not go well with the project that I was going for, but I got a lot of influence from him, and I also learned a lot from watching his tutorials, so I was able to apply that knowledge onto my project as well as the knowledge that I did experimenting with some of the layers that I created and experimenting with some of the tools that my teachers and lab instructors had shown me over the course of me being in school. So I took all of that knowledge and kind of Frankensteined it together and was able to get my final look. But before I even begin with that, the first thing I gotta do is bake out my maps. So here what I did was I began with baking. If you've ever used Substance Painter, it's pretty easy to import your project in. So I imported my low-res model, and then after that, I went to my texture set settings. I usually work in 4K, but since I am recording and my textures, this is my final Substance Painter file, I wanted to work in 2K. I will be showing you my work in 4K after I'm done with this, but for now, I will be working in this resolution. So I go to my bake mesh maps, and you will see here that I have all my high res. They are underscored with high, so it's underscore high. I usually do when I'm testing my bake, my high res maps. So here is the baking texture settings, and here is where I test out my high res bakes to my low res. And the way that I usually do that is by turning off all of these mesh maps and just having my normal. I put it at 2K, and here I just really don't change this. I have a desktop that allows me to be able to do this anti-aliasing subsampling 8x8, so to me that works for me, but I usually have this at 2 when I'm beginning a test. I also make sure that my by mesh name match is clicked on, and I make sure that my low and my high are named correctly. So I usually bake my textures. I'm not going to do that now, but if that doesn't end up working, I look at what the mistakes is. So, oh, okay, there we go. What I usually do is I have my normal maps baked out, and then I just look through every part of my project. I tend to notice if I have problems, it's usually at the edges, so that is my main concern, is looking at the edges and seeing if there's any big problems. I also make sure that the look of this detail that I put into the project is being shown, and I make sure that it's looking the way that I want it to without having it skewed or completely off. I don't see any major problems within the project while checking to see if there are any mistakes or any problems. I also check here, and I also look at the fabric. The high res baked down pretty well in that area, as well as the wrinkles coming out pretty well. They're not having any problems. So after checking to see that everything is good, I then go back to my baked mesh maps. I check to see if the settings are great, awesome. So after that, I end up working with my 4K map, and I click on everything except my ID, since I didn't do any IDing on this, and then I up this up to 8x8, and then that's about it. Is really all I do to baking. I've never really had problems with baking before, besides like having to test it a few times, or reminding myself to name it correctly, which is my biggest fault, is sometimes I forget to do the underscore high with a lowercase. So that's pretty much honestly the biggest problems I usually have with baking. But if you do want to learn more about baking, there are great tutorials done by Substance Painter that goes really in depth of how they do these mesh maps. So after looking at my concept and after baking down my map, the first thing I want to do is create my base layer. So I will be doing that now. So we are now going to begin So after baking down my maps and making sure that everything looked correct, my first step was to create my base layer for my project. So I began with the side piece that is here. The reason why is because I was going to use this as a base for the rest of my wood texture. As I mentioned beforehand, since I wanted to get this gradient look, some of these are going to have different colors as the base, which is fine. I just wanted to have you guys know that I didn't just create one whole layer for everything and then applied it to the entire model that was wood. As you can see here, this part of the door is extremely dark, and it's not anything close to how the rest of the project looks. This handle right here is extremely light. Right here is a lighter color than here and here. These are a lot more warmer colors. So for that, I had to make sure that I know exactly how I was going to go about this. So for the leg stands, I made them a little bit darker, and I wrote that down, that the leg stands and the door are darker than the base of the project. So I'm going to call this the base, since that is usually what I do first and base my project around that. So this is my base, and then for the two top pieces, I just worked on one layer and then duplicated this one over to this one, and I just brightened it up slightly more than this one just so I could get this look here, but I knew that the light would be influencing this a lot, so I didn't worry too much of making these two different colors. This was the exact same layer. I just duplicated the layer that I used for this one, and this shelf, I worked on this shelf right here, duplicated over here, brightened it a bit more, and then just duplicated that one over here. And the same things for the metals. So these metals right here are exactly the same as the metals that are down here. And the metal that is right here, I just ended up having that by itself. And right here, the sword with its own certain layer. I didn't really duplicate this over to anything else because, as you can tell, this has a lot more, I would say, I would have to add a little bit more AO to this to create that gradient that is here. So in that case, it's just honestly planning ahead of how you plan on texturing and making sure that you look at your concept a lot. That is what I did, and it did help me figure out how to do the coloring for my project. So in this, again, I'm not going to give a really in-depth tutorial of how I did this. I'm just going to explain I'm just going to mention the layers and kind of the filters that I added to them. So obviously for my base, I just added a base color. I just have my roughness and color that's really influencing it. The metal is just there. But here I made sure that my roughness was a little bit lower, so it wasn't too shiny, because wood isn't extremely shiny, especially old worn out wood. So after that, this is something that I learned from 3DEX from one of their tutorials, is to create kind of this they called it edges, and at first I wasn't very confused by what they mean, but now I understand what it means. Is it emphasizes the area that is around the edges, so it kind of creates a lighter color in the center, and the base color that you have, so if I was to turn this off, is just around the edges here, and you know, right over here as well, and it's just creating kind of a bright center that your eye is going to be drawn out to the edges. That's just practically what it's doing for this. It was a mask editor, and I just changed some of the settings to make it work for my project a little bit more. Since this is going to be affected by the blue lighting, my main focus was if I was to shift the lighting around, it would fit with the overall project, but I still wanted to be sure that if you remove the lighting from this, it wasn't just going to be one solid color and call it quits because the light's going to, you know, change it. I wanted to make sure that if you saw this without the light, it would still look, you know, like part of the closet. So for this, I just did the mask editor, changed some of the balances to it, the global balance. The next thing I did was add a sharpen to it. You can see that it mostly affects this area, right here, around the edges. Just brings more emphasis in those areas. Again, sorry for having it in 2K, but really don't want my computer to poop out on me. The next thing is adding a cavity to it. This kind of just adds an overall kind of darker color on top of it, just to add variety to it. You can change the opacity. You're more than welcome to do this. I just kept it like that because I thought it looked fine. Again, this is just the mask editor. This is something I was a bit hesitant on using since I am not like super confident with using lights and baked lighting in Substance Painter. That's just something that's foreign to me, but 3DEX videos helped me get a little bit more comfortable with using it, at least experiment wise, and in this case it did help out. I put it very, very low, as you can tell here, because if I was to even have it super bright, it would just completely wash out the colors that I had beforehand. It would just make it straight orange. But in this case, since I wanted the color to complement this, I knew that in this project there are a lot of browns and yellows, but I wanted to just add a little bit of red to it, and orange to just bring a little bit more emphasis on the wood texture. So after that, just added an AO. This was done, and it's saving, but this was done just to bring emphasis on the cavity that is right here of the wood carving, as well as bringing some emphasis on the edge around the tacking marks, and it also brings your eye up to the edge. So that is practically what my AO is. I put this on a generator that was used with a dirt generator that uses your AO a lot. So if you look here, this is something that my teacher showed us how to get these darkened edges to kind of create a semi gradient. It's very subtle, but it does just bring emphasis to this area right here, which could bring your attention here. So that is just how it is. It also does kind of give the illusion of dirt building, since dirt would build in areas like this, since it is an older piece of furniture. So having this is here. This I can explain to you. I took a brown color that was darker than my base, removed the roughness, went over here, added the black mask, added the generator, went over here, added a dirt generator, and here you can change the contrast of how it looks. You can, sometimes even if you want it there and you want it to have a sharp contrast, you can do it like that, but I like to have a softer look. So that is what I added to my project, and you can see quite the difference here. It's just kind of like a solid-ish color. I mean, there is a bit of a gradient, and you can see a lighter center here, but just adding this just gives a little bit more of depth to the project, and you can notice that it affects the areas that are there, so it just creates a shadow in that area that complements the look. So after that, I added another baked lighting. This is just a subtle one. This wasn't really necessary in my project, to be honest. I wanted to try baked lighting from the tutorials that I saw on 3DEX videos, but I kind of want to try it out. I don't really think that it influences a lot on the project, but I just kept it there because I wanted to say that I at least used it. The next thing I did was add a edge highlight. This is something that you should definitely have no matter what your piece is, even if it's a subtle one, but in this case it is a worn look, and I wanted to show a passage of time on this, and what is better than showing off a worn look to the edge. So in this case I added a edge highlight. I made it lighter than my base color. I added a black mask, and then I went over here, added a generator, and added a metal edge wear. So here I added the edge highlight, made it lighter color than my base. In this case, on my actual project, I have different versions or different colors of edge highlights that you can see. So I have this one right here that I actually based the color off of, so I just colored picked that. Oh, another tip I would really recommend for you guys to do. It is 100% okay for you guys to color pick straight from the concept. I do that and am able to replicate a lot closer to the concept. I know some people don't do that, and I don't know how they get away with it, because I've actually seen tutorials of people being able to just click the button and being like, that's the exact color, and I'm like, you guys got an eye that I do not have. So in this case, I color picked a lot. So for the base color of this base of my project, I actually ended up color picking in this area. I think I went with something that was like right here. And then for the darker areas that I saw, I ended up color picking from that little corner, if you can see it, just this little brown area right here, since that's kind of what I wanted. And then for the gradients, I ended up color picking from this. I think I went for a lighter color because I didn't want such a harsh one, and I'll be showing you that as well. But I did color pick most of my colors from this exact concept, if not all. So here I have my metal edge wear, and here you can change the wear level. I would say don't have anything like this. It just looks dirty to me, and not like the purpose. So here I added the edge highlight, and then I just changed the wear level here. I went for a mid type of one where it was just having a very strong highlight, but the thing with this is if you look at it, it's a little bit too uniformed. Well, not back here, but in the front, it's a little bit too uniform. There are some areas here that are just covered by the edge highlight. So in that case, I just come in with a paintbrush and erased some of that. So I just used an alpha and I went for dirt, and I think I ended up picking dirt cloudy. This is great because it has So this is great because it has those edges that are broken up, and it also has the gray and white and black values, but just go through here. Don't pick something that's straight up a line. It's going to look a little bit too noticeable. In this case, I just went with dirt stain, the dirt cloud. I went down. There's brushes for the Kyle brushes are pretty good too. I like using those if I'm going a little bit more in detail for this, but since I knew that I just wanted to break it up a little bit, that's all I did to this. The next thing I did was add a bit more of a dark value to these edges right here. I think it worked well because if you look at the concept, it is pretty dark here, and I wanted to showcase that with the shadows pointing down. If you see here, the color is very dark as well as here and here, so I just went in with a paintbrush, and I can show you how messy I went. I literally just swiped, and then I changed the opacity of it to lower it. I didn't remove it completely, but make sure that you are lowering the opacity to it, and that, I would say, does a pretty good job of putting in an AO in there without actually having to change the AO that's like up here. So after that, this is a layer that I accidentally misplaced. This is the layer that affects here. Just wanted to make sure you know that, because if I was to click on this and then go to mask, you will see it affects that area right there. So it just affects that one. So the next step that I did was adding a texture detail to this. It didn't really change it too much, so I'm just going to brighten this up a little bit more. I honestly should have made this a little bit brighter, or a little bit lighter than the actual color of my base color. As you can see, here is just what it looks like. What I ended up doing was going in here, going to a grunge map, adding a grunge to it, and then changing the levels. This is something that I was taught in school, to add somewhat of texture to it without disrupting the scene. This is just to add a subtle change to it. Don't make it super dramatic, but in this case, I wanted to just add a little bit to it so it would just affect the edges here. So if you see in the actual thing, if I was to click on it, you can see it like right in these areas. I did show that a little bit more on the shelves, since the shelves, I would say, are going to get dirty. They're going to have a lot more stains on them, so I did add them to the shelves a lot more, but in this area, I guess I didn't want to emphasize that too much, but that is something that I would say I should have done. I also changed the opacity from 100 to 51 was the number. So let me change that. And this is just something to keep your project from just having a flat color. Or not a flat color, but just a unbusy texture towards it. You don't have to do that. I just did it because wood textures are never just a color of like gradients. It does have some stains to it, so I made sure to add that on there. Next thing, so for this one, all I added was, again, another darker color. So for me, what I was trying to achieve in this is, because I noticed this in the project, I should have emphasized it a little bit more, but there is a dark color here and then a lighter color that goes out. I guess I was trying to go for that, but the thing is, it's really not that noticeable unless you're like right on top of it. So that's just an extra layer I have to create a deeper line here for the AO. That's again just a dirt generator. Changed the dirt level and created a higher contrast for the dirt. The next thing I did is my gradient. So in this case, I would say please remember what I mentioned beforehand, where I wanted to add gradients because I know that my lighting wasn't going to be able to achieve this look that I wanted. So in this case, I used this as a base for how this was going to look. So I went from this I went from darker to lighter here. So I will show you how I did that. So I picked a color that was a red brown. I would say that's a pretty deep brown. So that's a little bit darker. Well, not a little bit. It's actually a lot darker than my base. And I go up here and I click on it. And you can see the change in the overall look. And it just adds a gradient from here to here. And I ended up achieving the look that I wanted with that. Also, I know the blue lighting is going to affect here, but I did add it to every other individual piece that is in the project. I also added a bit of roughness to it. So if I was to go to the roughness channel, you can see that there is a bit of a roughness change there. That's just so it's not just one flat color, but at the end, I added a roughness layer. I misspelled that. I was kind of in a rush writing these things down. But here, I just added a roughness. So, roughness layer. I removed everything else, pumped this up to be higher. And then I went in here, went into the masks, and went to the mask editor and messed around with the settings. I am actually kind of thankful for 3D for showing me a lot about the mask editor. I didn't really use it a lot since it seemed very daunting to me, but having him explain each setting and also being able to show us how it works in his tutorial videos honestly helped a lot for me to do this by myself. This was a great thing that my lab instructor mentioned to me, is because I always felt like my project was always too flat. Every time I did a portfolio piece, and one day my lab instructor was just like, oh, just add a roughness channel. And this definitely helps a lot more with metals, but it also helps out with just overall textures in general, just helps a lot more with metals. And she told me add a roughness map to it. You can add a generator. She usually tells me to either add a dirt. You can switch between these. Heck, you can even sometimes use the smart masks or the grunges, but in this case I wanted to test it out with the mask editor, and I actually really liked how it came out. So if I was to pop it out, I did that, and here I just added the different textures that you can see here. I think I only used it for that one. A big thing I would recommend you to do if you plan on using this somewhat as a tutorial is to know that Sketchfab has a tendency to not show off the roughness so much on stuff that isn't metal. So if you are using Sketchfab as your presentation program, make sure to up your roughness just slightly more than what you think you would need, just so it'll show up on Sketchfab. So after doing that, I just showed you the basic or the base of almost all my layers that are here, the metal being a little bit different and the flag, but I can explain that to you. And those are the layers I did. And after that, I just went through each piece of my project. So here, the stands, like I said beforehand, I knew that my legs were going to be darker, so my base color for that is darker. I went to the wood small. This is just a duplicate of this. I ended up making this a little bit darker, just so you look at this, it is a bit darker in these areas compared to like this. So I did just duplicate this over and made it darker. The next thing is the middle top here. You can see that there is a grading coming from here to here. The reason why I didn't make this super warmed tone like this, almost a yellow orange, is because I was going to use a light from Sketchfab that was going to just focus on directly this. I was going to have my environment light that focused on the middle, my blue light that comes here, and my light that comes down here that was going to give off a yellow-orange tint that would give the effect that I want from this. Like I mentioned beforehand, I went through all of my edges and broke them up some pieces. So that's just something I also did. This one is the gradient as well. So I have it going from dark to light. It's the same exact whatchamacallit, generator. The only thing that I would change is my position of the X, Y, and Z, and sometimes I would change the radius, the offset, and the contrast, and sometimes you would even need to invert it. It's just usually messing around with the scene. Try starting off with everything on default, and then just move the settings corresponding with the direction that you want it to go. So the next one I did was the bottom, and here I had a lot of my AO having this darkened look to it, and I think it did a really good job of kind of showing a old worn look to it. You can even sometimes see the roughness here. Yeah, that doesn't really show up too much in Sketchfab, so like I said beforehand, just boop it up a little bit more. If you think you have it, you probably need a little bit more. So after doing my bottom, the next thing I did was my shelf. So here you can see a lot more of the dirt or the texture look that I was going for, as well as roughness and that gradient, since in the back of the picture you can see that there is that dark gradient that is there, as well as here and here. So I actually did a harsher gradient in these areas just to show the depth within the bookcase, as well as when the light is hitting there, no matter how the environment is set up, this is always going to be dark. So after doing that, I just duplicated it over and use that. As you can tell, I changed the colors for slightly on some of them, just so they don't all look the same. And then if you look at the roughness, I did add the dirt, so I made them all different. That is something I would recommend you to not do. I tried it out, and I thought it looked a little bit too off. So I would recommend you to try to keep at least a minimum of like 2 different maps for your roughness, and just changing the opacity or the overall balance of it if you want to like remove some of the roughness from it. So, and this, I worked on my handle. I made my handle lighter because in the concept you can see that is lighter. You can also see in the concept that it goes very dark here and then just brightens up very quickly to the top. So I was able to do that. So I just, again, added the gradient from here to here. I just pulled it back a lot more so it would just be focused here. And next thing I did was the metal base. Here you can see a very, very strong gradient, and again, the reason for this is so I would be able to set up my lights however I want and not have to worry about, oh, this is gonna look super bright, it's gonna look, you know, like it's lit inside. I didn't have to worry about that. After doing that, I added my wooden door. Again, this is something that I actually ended up creating some different layers for, so let me open that up. So here I changed a lot of my baked lighting. I ended up removing some of the stuff on there. And here, so after I finished my handle, I started working on my door, and you can see quite a difference between my main piece, which are very similar in color, just slight shifts of hues within it, to just having a straight up almost brown door. Like it shows in the concept, it is quite a difference. I just wanted to make sure that I had my highlight be a little bit yellow. So when you look at this, the highlight is a lot more yellow compared to this, and that's just because I wanted to have that defined a little bit more. I added a gradient coming from down here to here. I just ended up making my gradient a lot harsher and changing the colors a little bit more here. So for the edge, the second layer that I created in my overall materials for each one, I just made sure that I emphasized it a little bit more, just so you can see there is a color shift right there. So after that, my wooden back, I added a little bit more of the texture difference. So I just made it a little bit lighter, kind of made it look a little bit beaten up and rough because this is an older piece. So some discoloration is there. And I made that a lot darker than the rest of my project because I wanted to make sure that it does look like it is in the back. My prop bottom is over here, nothing too crazy. In the concept, there is a difference between the two of them. So this one is just a brown and yellow, and then this one is just like a golden brown. So that is pretty much what I just did to these two. And then after that, any more wood texturing? Nope, that is all the wood that I did. The rest was the prop, the metal, and the flag. So I'm going to explain. Actually forgot this part right here. So in the concept, you see that there is some old chipped wood. So I guess naturally the wood looks like this, or they just really wanted to look cool. So for this, all I did was pick a color that was fairly close to the actual concept. I didn't color pick it exactly because there was a bit of a hue color coming off of it and I didn't want to add that to it. So what I just did is I added kind of a pale yellow to it, and then after that I just went into the paint, got a I actually ended up getting a chalk brush from this. So I ended up getting one of these charcoal ones and just putting it in there. Nothing too crazy. I did change the opacity of it so it wasn't straight up like that. I wanted to make it look like it was actually worn into the wood, not that it would look like it sits there naturally. So just wanted to make it feel natural. The next part I'm going to explain is my cloth. So for my cloth, I kept everything pretty much the same. I actually dialed down a lot on some of these. So I created my base, and then in my concept you can see that there is a red fabric that lays below it. So here what I just did is I added another layer. I painted that onto my UVs, and having them laid out like this was very simple for me to just straight on just color it in there. And then I made the roughness a little bit different just so you can see there is a distinct look to it. And then the clasp, I did the exact same thing, just added a little bit of a darker color to it. I think I just duplicated that over. The edges, I ended up actually pulling that back a lot because I didn't want it to start adding color in the areas that it didn't need to. Since this is curved, I was using a technique that is what I use usually for hard surface. The cavities, I made sure it was a little bit darker. And then after that, I just did an AO, but I just added it a lot darker than the base color, just so it would look like shadows that naturally lay on the fabric. And then I didn't add texture details, obviously, but in this case, I added silver bolts, just made it metallic. It's just a metallic layer. And then after that, I added somewhat of a roughness layer to it. And then the metal rod is something I just slapped on from the same materials that I used from this. So I just duplicated that over. My silver coins were pretty basic. It wasn't anything too crazy. I just made sure that there was some roughness variation on it, so when you look through it, it doesn't just straight up look like metal. Coins are dirty and they lose its shininess and they sometimes get tarnished, so I wanted to add that. But in the concept, I saw that they looked, I wouldn't say fairly new, so I still wanted to add that detail to it. So after doing that, my next step was my metals. So I'm going to work and explain to you how I did that. So it's honestly the exact same thing that I did for my wood, except it's just a metal material. So here I added my color, I added my roughness, and I added my metal. So my metal was all the way to 1, and my roughness was a little bit shinier than it usually is. But the reason why is because I was adding all these other materials to it, and these I made all metallic as well, so they would all work together. But in this case, I went around giving this dirty look to the project, just to add to it. So these were to brighten up the project, because in Sketchfab it was looking very dark, so I just added those color variations that I learned to add some light to it. The AO is just, again, the same, darkening up the area. Bakelite, the same, just darkening it up to make it look a little bit more worn out. And then after that, I added my edge highlight. I made sure that that was almost like straight up white, and the reason why is because I wanted the edge highlight to actually highlight. So I did that, as well as upping up the roughness, because I usually kept the other channels a little bit lower on the roughness to add that variation to it. And then I added my texture details to it, and that just helped give it a dirty, worn look. And that's honestly what I did with my metal maps. It's the exact same thing I did here. The only difference is in the concept. In the concept you see here, there's just a lighter metal that seems to be on the rim of the sword. I didn't do anything crazy with that. The same thing that happened here, I applied to the handle, and the same thing that was done on here is done on the actual helmet. So I will click those on so you guys can see that. So here you see on my my sword, there is a bit of a green tint to it. That is just me adding a little bit more opacity to my green light that I had on my this one right here. So I just added a little bit more light to it, just so I could have kind of that green gray look that I was trying to achieve for. For this, I just added yellow light lines to it, because that is what is shown here. And then for this, I made sure, for the sword as well, I made sure that this part was a lot lighter than this and this, since in the concept you can see that this part lights up slightly more. This one has a stronger AO, so that's what I just applied to the edges. And then after that, I was prepared to do some paper. The paper that I used here was the same that I used on top of here. It wasn't anything too crazy. I think I just removed one of the channels. So that is the paper. I kind of kept everything the same since I didn't really sculpt this, and it was pretty simplistic in shape. All I really did was add a base color that was a little bit brighter, and then I just added darker colors on top of the project to give a old, worn, medieval look to it. So you have my edges right there, and then my cavity. So that just went all throughout, so that worked out for me. And then my AO to add kind of a variation to the color, because that usually happens with old paper. And then I added my baked lighting to it, which just gave an overall more yellow brown look to it. My edge highlights for some of the areas that are a little bit more worn down, and then my texture, which honestly gave a great paper look to it that is worn and old, something that looks like someone would make. And then after that, I added the writing. In the concept you can't really see the writing, so I kind of just finessed it by writing numbers and symbols and hoping that nobody reads that part. So that is honestly what I did for the paper. I did the exact same thing for the books. So after doing that, the next thing I did was this armor piece. This one was a bit difficult to work with since I never really worked with leather, and in this I would say, yeah, that's leather. I also wasn't very happy with how this came out, and I will probably be coming back and changing this and applying what I learned at the end of this project to this, because this was something that I honestly struggled with and I was trying to find ways to fix. But here, I wanted to make sure that I got the darker color here and the lighter colors here, as well as the silver buttons, so I was able to get those colors how I wanted them. This was honestly the material that I used for the belt, which I will be showing you how I did. So after working on that piece really quickly, which was honestly just copying the belt, applying the layer right here, and then copying the belt again, and then applying a lighter layer here. The next thing I worked on was this piece right here, which was the metal. This one I wanted to give it a much more worn look compared to the other, so I added a more aggressive AO to it to just add that dirtiness to it, and then that was pretty much it. I kept the metals pretty simple since they weren't the main focus of the project. The next thing that I worked on was the book. This one this one was causing me problems because, again, I've never really worked with leather, and I'm guessing that is what the material is. If you look here, it looks leathered, obviously, and here's leather, and then this one's leather right now. So for this one, it was just a lot of trial and error. I created my base color, which was this, which was a brown. I actually color picked this from an actual leather piece. And then the edges was something that was a little bit more warmer tone, something that looks like it would be in a piece of leather that's new. The next was adding a cavity that kind of went over everything to create a dark brown. Next was AO, just to create somewhat of a change in colors, almost as though, you know, it is skin. Bake light that just went over everything. Edge highlight on the edges just to show a kind of worn look to it. And then the texture details, I think, actually helped a lot because this is how it was starting to look and I was getting frustrated. And then I remembered this area right here and I said maybe just adding a texture detail will give it more of a leathered, or at least give it a texture so it's not just straight up flat. So what I did was the same thing with the belt, except the belt was a lot lighter, and I ended up using a layer to have a height and color channel, push this back, and that was about it. And then the pot was here, so this one was honestly super simple to do. It's just gold and black, nothing too fancy. The black is a lot more reflective. Made sure that I didn't do pitch black, nothing too crazy. The feather was the only part that I had to look up and actually take the time to look through and Google, but I show you how I set that up in Sketchfab since I really didn't necessarily need to do that in Substance Painter. So after adding the pot, I added my books, and here I added the details that you see in the book here. This is in 2K. It looks a lot better in 4K, so after I'm done, I will be sure to show you how I did that. But for the book, it was a blue color, and this was a purple, so I just color picked from here, add somewhat of a gradient, just so it's just not a flat color, so it's like a purple here and a lighter purple here, a darker purple or blue here and a lighter blue here. So that is what I did here as well. And then the book leather is just the straps that are wrapped around the projects. And then the metal weird is this part right here. I still don't know what this is. Still trying to guess. You know, if you know what it is, please put it under the comments. It will actually be kind of interesting to see what you think this is. But that was just something that I ended up just using this texture onto here. I just ended up changing a few of the colors, so it was a lot more washed out than this. So the next thing I did was add the picture that you see here. So what I actually did was I brought this into Photoshop, did the outline of this area right here, made sure I fixed any of the angles, I flipped it so it was straight, and then I went into Substance Painter, and actually let me see if I can find the actual PNG right here. So it's it's right here, and you can see the very crude rough drawing I did, but if you look at it here, I just built the colors up. Again, I can show this on the 4K, so I'll show that when I'm ready to show this in 4K and explain how I did that. So I added my chalk layer, and this is the numbers that you see on the side. Surprisingly, this actually took some time because I wanted to make sure that it looks like it was broken up and it wasn't just a straight, you know, mouse. I wanted to actually make it look like someone was writing on the actual objects. So here I just did a swipe, and then I added this chalk type filter onto it so it can make it look broken up. So essentially this is how my final project looked, but not really. So I'm going to move this over to 4K, and I'm going to show you the last step that I did to this project. So here are my 4K textures, and here you can see it's not as pixelated as it was in 2K. So for this specific layer, what I did was I built up the design, So if you see here, you can see that there is a light, almost opaque pink, a black outline, and then a pink shield, and then these pink lines right here that are the same color as this. So what I did is just built it up. I added a pink opaque background, added the black line, and then added the shield and the two bars. And then here, this one, this one's my artistic masterpiece, but here what I did was I brought this in, pasted it on through here, so we're right there. So I just rotated it, found a perfect spot for it that would hit this area right here, and then I just built up the colors in these areas. I wanted to give it a kind of crude look to it, since it is something that isn't like printed on. It is going to be probably written by someone, so I just added that there. And then after I was done with that, I change the opacity to I think like 75 and 60 to make it look like it is written on it, and kind of a worn fading look to it. I also added these lines. I don't know what it says over here, but I didn't want to forget to do that, so I added that to the project. So after this, you see my project, and it looks pretty decent. So after adding the wood textures, after adding all the metal and prop textures and seeing how it looks, I am going to add a top layer that one of my teacher was very kind to let me and a other student have. This is what essentially just adds a gradient for the entire project. He taught us what each of the layers do and how it influences, or how it affects the. So now that I am done, the next step I was going to do and did was add the top layer that my teacher, his name is Chops, did. His art station is down below, and if you have any questions about these top layers and the details and the effects that it has on the layers, you are more than welcome to message him on ArtStation. He will definitely respond to you, since he did such a great job on this, as well as allowing me and another student use it. But in this case, I will show it to you. This is just going to add a gradient to the entire project and give it a stylized look. So it's going to take a while, so I'll show you how it looks when it's up. So this is what it does to the project. It creates a gradient all throughout it, and I think it does a really good job of emphasizing the leather looks, the metal. It adds a little bit more to the AO, as well as creating those darkened looks of the metal that I wanted. So he gave us an in-depth tutorial of what all these do and how it affects the asset, as well as understanding how each of these layers and what they do and the filters that are in them do. So definitely check him out. His work is phenomenal, and he's honestly a great person to get critiques from as well for stylized work, since that is what he specializes in. So I also changed the opacity. If I was to have it at 100, it would look like this. So having it how it's supposed to be works for me. You can see quite the difference in it. So now that I am done texturing, the next thing I am going to do is again get a critique on this. So I ended up getting a critique on this from a couple of my lab instructors, as well as some acquaintances and friends from school, and people on the Discord channel. I ended up asking for critiques on the club and Hand Painters Guild, and I got some really great feedback. So after that, I am ready to export these textures out. So I'm just going to show you really quickly how I did it. So in here, I just went to Bookcase, went to my my drive, went to Bookcase, and then here I went to textures, so you will see it here. So I selected the folder, and I knew I was going to use Sketchfab, so to make my life a lot easier, I just clicked Sketchfab as my config, made sure that it was all in 4K, and then textured it out. And that's honestly how I went through my entire step 4. If any of you guys have any more questions about how I went around picking out the colors and how I looked at the concept, you're more than welcome to message me about that. But if you're also interested in the more into the layers and how I ended up texturing them, you are again also more than welcome to hit me up on ArtStation or my email about this as well. Since this is just a block out, I just wanted to explain quickly how I went through each of my groups. So now we are ready to set up our presentation shots. So in this step, I'm going to show you how I set up my Sketchfab link, my ArtStation page, as well as how I set up my Photoshop file to do my presentation shot. In this case, I use Sketchfab as my presentation area where you can go see my project, and here is essentially where I kind of just did the lighting for my prop, and my main concern was trying to get the look of my project to be as close to the concept, especially for the lighting. So in the concept art, there is 2 lights that are in the scene. I added 3 in total. There is the blue cooler tone light that is hitting the side of the bookcase that affects this area and this area right here, and there is the light that comes from here affecting this whole area right here. I ended up adding another light up here to be able to add more of that gradient that I did in the textures, because I knew that I was going to be using Sketchfab and I was going to use the environment and the lighting that was in Sketchfab. So even after knowing that and adding in it my gradient, I also wanted to add a light here that would be able to highlight a warmer color up here to, you know, bring attention to that area, as well as bring attention to here and bring attention to this area right here. So this is why it's kind of important to look at your concept for a while and see if there is lighting in your concept and plan your project around that lighting as well. So this is you having to think of, like, you know, 5 steps ahead of you. And in this case, I knew that I would be using Sketchfab, so I knew that my lighting would be a little bit more limited compared to like Marmoset, Unreal, and even sometimes Maya. So knowing that in Sketchfab I could essentially have, you know, a total of probably 5 lights, I wanted to make sure that I at least had 3 lights in my scene that would be able to hit this area, and hit the side. Knowing that Sketchfab is very limited in some of the options where I couldn't be able to change my model directly like in Unreal and sometimes even in Marmoset, I made sure to add a gradient within my texture. So that is something that I planned ahead of and added it, as well as being able to move my lights around in Sketchfab to do it. So knowing where my lights are in the scene, I move on to this and wrote down exactly what type of lights that I would need and worked with that. But before I even touch my lights, the first thing I want to do is add my materials to this project. So I essentially use the model that I used in Substance Painter for Sketchfab. It's easier that way because I know that the textures are going to work no matter what. So I imported it into Sketchfab. Fairly easy to do that step. So I go to the materials tab and I go to base color, metal map, roughness, my AO, and my normal map. I plug in the maps that I booted out of Substance Painter. I use the Sketchfab export setting because I knew that this was going to be used in Sketchfab and it's easier to work with that. So that is what I did. I did that to this. It's fairly simple. I didn't have anything crazy. The only thing that probably would have been considered in quotes crazy is adding the feather, which had a opacity channel to it. So I just grabbed a PNG from Google, put it into the base color, and then put it again in opacity, and that's all I really did to that. It's fairly easy. the next thing I did was set up a little bit more of my scene. I changed the field of view from Sketchfab from 90, which I think is the default setting, to 45. And the reason why I do that is, if you want to see, that is how it would look in, I believe, the default setting for Sketchfab. So I didn't want to get this fisheye look to it. You can see that, it kind of gives that fisheye look, and that's not what I wanted, since I think it doesn't fit my scene at all or my project. So I would recommend going between 35 to 50 for your field of view. Next thing you can do is change the wireframe. I ended up using black because if I switched it to red, this would be a little bit, lost in the scene. White could probably work pretty well too, but in this case I just used black. Didn't really change that. And then the background, I ended up picking a color that was similar to the concept background because I think it complements it pretty well. It doesn't, distract from the main focus, but at the same time it isn't such a huge contrast, like super white or super black, for you to be like, you're losing some of the details and shadows. So I picked that color just because I think it does complement it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off my post-processing filters so we can focus on the lighting. And in this step, I mainly just focused on my lighting, and the reason why I would recommend you to add your materials before you touch your lighting is to see how your overall model, including the textures, will be affected by the lights. So in this step, the lighting portion, I actually am going to also turn off these so we can focus on the environment. So for me, at least, what I tend to do is I tend to go through each and every environment that I see and write down the ones that I think complement my project. And in this case, I look through all of them, and I ended up really liking how the glazed patio by restaurant looks. I think that it captured the look of the concept from this portion right here. So something I did know I was going to do is I know I was going to have essentially three lights: my environment lighting, the lighting that comes from up top to get this look, and the lighting that comes over here, which is very distinct since it has a certain color and look to it. So in this case, my main focus was getting this area right here lit in a way that I think complements the model, as well as replicating the concept lighting very closely. So I wasn't too focused on how the top was going to look and how this was going to look, because I knew that I was going to have lights that would affect that area. So in this case, I wanted to make sure I get, the darker values here and the lighter values here on my model, as well as get these shadows across the project. I wanted to make sure that this is, bright in this area, but having a darker gradient here. So that's why I also added gradients in my textures, because I knew that in Sketchfab it was going to give me that option to do it. So in this in mind, I just mainly focused on getting this area lit. In this case, I liked how this looked, although my project is a little bit washed out. I can always go into my post-processing filters and add a little bit of a redder hue to it. So that is what I ended up doing. So in this case, my main focus was just this area. I got the look that I wanted with the sharp shadows here, which you can see in the concept. I also got a little bit of a highlight there. I ended up getting the shadows that I wanted here, as well as here, where you can see a darker shadow here, and the gradient is moving to a lighter value here. And I quite liked how this looked. Maybe it was a little bit too bright, so if you saw, my original settings for this was 2, and I got what I wanted here. Here I could see, there was going to be a bit of a problem, but I knew I was going to add a light that was going to be a little bit lighter than this. So after setting up this and looking at the different environments there was, I ended up moving over to adding actual lights. So here you have a bunch of different options here. I would never recommend most of these. The 3-point lighting is pretty good by itself. That is what my teacher told me, and it's been working pretty well. So here I used the 3-point light, ended up turning off one of the lights because I didn't need it, and it's fine to do that. Sometimes you might not need all 3 lights in an environment. Sometimes you might just need an environment, a light. So you just have to fiddle a lot around with the settings and feel confident that you just need to feel what is right for you. Another thing, like I've mentioned a billion times beforehand, always get critiques on your lighting. That is what I did, and I ended up actually pushing myself a little bit more to doing more to my project than less. So I have a tendency to do less to my project because I'm afraid of pushing the project a little bit and going back to it. And thankfully, I had a great lab instructor who gave me a great tip, which was, add more light to it. So in this case, what I usually do is I turn off this so everything is black on my model, add my lights, or turn on my lights. So in this case, I'm going to show you how I ended up getting the lighting on the left side. I switched my lights. So I switched my light from a directional or direction light to a spotlight. I think this ended up working a lot better than the other option. I mean, you can still have it, but I think it was just a little bit too bright for this, and I wanted to get a softer look to it, and this settings allow me to achieve that look. So you can go through these and just try out whichever light ends up working for you. In this case, it was spot. So I ended up pushing the intensity to the max, added a very blue color to it since that is what we are shown in the concept, and I just messed around with the settings until I found something that I liked. But what I usually do first is I end up positioning my light and then I end up moving the settings around because I think that works a lot better. Another thing I did was add cast shadows because if I didn't, then the entire scene would, or these areas right here, would be lit, which I did not want that to happen. I just wanted to mainly focus on this area. So after setting up this light, which is kind of the same movements that you would do in Maya, you just have to make sure that you are kind of doing a rotation on it while you are setting up your lights, because you might accidentally end up, pushing this down and be like, that looks right, but when you look over here, it's all the way over here. So just make sure you are rotating around to see where your lights are hitting. So after that, I turned this off, added my spotlight, and started on getting the top portion of the lights done. In this case, it was very easy since I thankfully had some practice with the spotlight, so I kind of knew what settings I needed to do. I did a warmer orange colors to affect this area, and again add somewhat of a gradient from here to here, which I ended up achieving. So here I just mainly focus on getting this top portion of the project lit. Wasn't focused on the bottom, just this area, and I just moved around the camera or the light, and I also changed the setting to this. I obviously turned off cast shadows, or turned on cast shadows, so I don't affect the areas down below. I just wanted to affect those areas. So after doing that, I turned on both lights, saw how it looked back at my concept, and I usually have this, open no matter what on the side, but I saw here that I got these two looks achieved, and then after that I added my environment light to it and saw around it and thought, that looks pretty good. I approve. So the final step that I did here in Sketchfab was essentially add some post-processing filters. So a great thing that Sketchfab has is that sometimes you see here like, oh, my project looks completely different from what it does in Substance Painter. The reason why for that is Substance Painter has different environment setups as well as lighting. So most of the time, the settings that you have in Substance Painter will not look the same as Sketchfab. So you're going to have to work with your project and work with the tools that Sketchfab gives you, and one of the tools that it gives you is this area right here. So in this case, I added some more AO to my project, which is what this tab does right here, the SSAO. Here, it essentially, and if you ever have a question about anything, just hover over the question mark and it will tell you what it does. So here it adds ambient occlusion, And something great is that, say I looked at this project and thought, it really doesn't have a strong, AO map to it. Now I got to go back to Substance Painter, fix it, and then boot out the textures again, replace it here. You don't have to do that. Sketchfab has great tools that allow you to change the project from here. So if you look here, especially in the hinges, you can see the change. You can even see it around the edges, especially, and you can see there is a addition of the AO there. So Sketchfab having this helped a lot since, I added on and saw, that actually does look a lot better. I'm going to do that. So sometimes you might just need to turn on some of these settings and be like, all right, I liked how that looks. Like, see, I thought this was a little bit too reflective for my taste. I turned it off, and you can see the roughness values to it that I was trying to achieve. So after adding this, I added a sharpness to it, just a slight one. It may not be too noticeable in the video, but in Sketchfab it is noticeable, as well as in my photos. So here my main focus was just a little bit of a sharpness, not too much. The next part is a vignette, which brings focus to my project. It draws your eye from here to here very quickly. So I wanted to add a little bit more to this, as well as, add a little bit more of a gradient around the edges than just having it a pitch gray color. Not pitch gray, it's not pitch black, just a gray, darker color. So a vignette just adds to it and brings the focus to your project. The next thing I added was a bloom. I just wanted to give it a little bit more of that fantasy vibe that I felt from the project over. So I didn't add such a huge bloom effect to it. It's honestly just 0.1, but I think it just complements my project enough to make it affect the metals. So I think that worked. And like I said beforehand, Sketchfab has great tools for you to use, so you don't have to go into Substance Painter. So another thing is I ended up adding a color balance for the midtones, especially for the reds. Like I mentioned beforehand, Sketchfab has great tools for you to use. If you don't want to go back to Substance Painter and change your whole maps, you can just do it here and add a bit of a color hue to it, which ended up actually helping me not have my project look so washed out. So these are the post-processing filters that I did to my project. You can come here and turn off and on, change the settings to anything that you feel like your project could benefit from. In this case, I went through all of them, ended up taking out the grain, depth of field, the chromatic aberration, the toning map, because I knew that it wouldn't really affect or help enhance my project. Don't think of these as fixing your mistakes, think of it as enhancing your project. So after working on this, I posed my project in a way that I like, so I'm going to show you how I did that. Since I am trying to get as close to the concept art that I can, I had this open on another screen and tried to angle it where you could see this portion as well as the side and get the flag and the sword in view. So the sword isn't being covered up, but the flag is still noticeable. I'm making sure that you see this engraving, and this engraving because of the time that I spent on it, as well as making sure that you see the best parts of my project and getting this area shown as well without covering anything else or covering this part up. So what I mostly did was I just moved stuff around until I got the position that I wanted. Like I said beforehand, my project was, or my concept was set at an angle, so I wanted to make sure that you could see this from any way and it wouldn't be proportionally wrong, and sometimes you're not able to get it perfectly, but I set it up where you could see it. And that is how I posed my project. You want to make sure that you're posing your project in a way that isn't just a front view, a side view, or a back view. You want to add somewhat of an angle to it to, make sure that you're showing the parts of the project that you spent a lot of time on, and that was my main focus, is showing off this wood engraving that I did in ZBrush, as well as the metal, the sword, the flag, and the area right over here. I made sure to angle my project as well as make sure that everything is in view. So after this, I went into the Sketchfab lab experiments, which allowed me to create a GIF as well as high resolution screenshots of my project, and I'm going to show you how I did that. So here is the lab's Sketchfab experiments. It's right here. It's Sketchfab lab experiments. I apologize. But here you can see that they give you a ton of tools and options to show off your project. In this case, I use the GIF export as well as the screenshots tool. So I'm going to show you this part. I use this mostly for Twitter because I think it shows off every angle of your project, and I think this works best for specifically showcasing on your phone. So in here, all I did was take the URL of my Sketchfab link, load scene, went here, pasted it, went to load, and your project will load up. And the next thing I did was just changed it to HD 720. In this case, this worked pretty well for Twitter. The HD 1080 doesn't allow you to use it on Twitter because of how high it is. So after that, I change the duration of the turntable, which is what it's going to do, for 5 seconds. If you have a project that has a lot of details on the back as well, you can probably change that to 10 seconds so the viewer has enough time to look through it. In this case, since I knew my back is pretty bland compared to my front, I made sure that it was just in 5 seconds, made it a GIF, and rendered it out. So here is the export of my gift in my Mac. It's not going to show me the actual gift. I have to go quickly through it, but this is how it will turn out. And here I just airdropped it over to my iPhone and I had it in place. It's the name of the project that you have on Sketchfab, and it just calls it a GIF. So that is what I did for the first part. This is totally optional. You are not required to do this, or you aren't even, needed to do this. I just think it's helpful for me to showcase it on Twitter or my Facebook for a quick look at if they don't have the ability to open up Sketchfab on whatever device that they're using. After I do that, the next thing I do is I go to screenshots and I load up my scene again. And here it gives you a ton of options to affect your project, especially for the transparent background. So what I usually do is I turn this on so it creates a PNG that allows you to import it into any type of program that you're using to create your screenshot or your presentation shot. So in this case, I am using Photoshop for it. The next thing I did was turn off the vignette because I'm going to add my own vignette to my portfolio shot, but I want to keep on the post-processing filter. So this is what it's essentially adding on to it. So after this, I usually do this in 4K resolution, but since I am just doing a quick one, I'm just going to show you how I did it. So I exported the screenshot of how my project looks default wise, and after that I usually move it around for different angles. I get different shots of the angles that I did, so maybe I just inched it a little bit more. I turned it a little bit more this way, and then after that, after I take around 5 different screenshots of how the project looks compared to the concept, my next step is usually just picking different angles overall. So maybe I want to get more of an angle like this. Maybe I want to get an angle that's closer to this so you can see the details of the wood. Or maybe I got a detail of more of this. So I take around 15 screenshots in total of this project in different angles and different looks, and even sometimes in different lighting. So here maybe I want to add a more dramatic lighting, mysterious look to it. I will screenshot this so I can look at it in Photoshop and see if I like it or not. So this is the presentation shot. I actually got this file from my teacher while I was going through one of my portfolio classes. This was fairly easy to use. You just change the settings in the background to either add new colors, change the texture background, and add different types of vignette, as well as setting up your name, contact information, so you can have it up here. I don't tend to like having my name up here. I like to either have it on either bottom corner. The reason why for this is because I feel like it grabs your attention too much if it's up here, mostly because I read top to down or top to bottom, then bottom to top. So the first thing I'm going to notice is here and then move down to here to get my name, but I want to make sure my name is clearly there. So After this, I pick the vignette I want, and that is how I make my presentation shot. It's pretty easy, to be honest. The way that you guys can set this up is by creating a background colors. You can add a folder of the colors that you think you would be using. In this case, I usually go with mid to dark grays. Sometimes I even do it in a color. Lighter colors tend to work pretty well, so or cooler colors tend to work well, so I go with more blues. This is just, if you want a quick selections of backgrounds. The other thing my teacher did for us was create background textures. This one has different ones. They have pavement, plank wood, brick wall, speakers, clean me. So these are just different ones that he allowed us to pick from. In this case, I just kept it with the volcanic rock. I think it looked pretty decent. I didn't think that I took too much from the project. It just keeps the background from being bland, to me at least. And here I set up my main presentation shot. After this, I bring in 2 other angles of my project, and I would add the first one here. I would make it fill up the screen as much as possible, and then the second one I would add right around here above this and make it smaller. This one would be an angle of this that is completely different from what you see here, and I'm about to show you that when I do show you how I did my ArtStation page. But in this case, I wanted to mainly focus on this piece right here, since this is my final presentation shot that I want to show and be the first thing you see when you open up my ArtStation page. Another thing I would recommend you guys to do, this is something I do a lot, is create a thumbnail shot. This case, I literally just removed my contact information, just had this right here. So when I go into ArtStation, I can pick this file or this JPEG and bring it into ArtStation and set this up specifically to only be my thumbnail so you can see this. After creating roughly around like 3 photos or presentation shots of my project, I move on to ArtStation. So for ArtStation, you can see here that I did create a thumbnail that doesn't have my name or contact information on it. So I click on it and it pops up, and the first thing you see is my first final presentation shot. Important thing to do before you upload anything, make sure you double check to see that your name, your first and last name, is spelled correctly, as well as your email. Pick an email that is user friendly, or at least kind of friendly for anyone who wants to use it. Your first name, last name is pretty good, and if that's already taken, just add a 01 to the end of it. That works pretty well. The second shot that I like to post on ArtStation is the different angled of it and a different side of the project. Again, making sure that my first name, last name, and my email is correct. And then I add a link to my Sketchfab, and it's embedded here into the ArtStation link, so you can click on this and manually, or not manually, but you can see it from here. So after that, I make sure to add a picture of the concept art, as well as give credit right away to the concept artist right here. This is a direct link to the page of the concept artist, as well as the direct page to the concept. And I also make sure to give credit right away to the concept artist down here in the summary page. After that, I go into the settings. It's giving me a little weird thing. I hate when it does that, but if you go into edit, the project thumbnails right here, this is where you can upload your thumbnail and then crop it to the size that you want it to. And then after that, I make sure to tag my project. So this is just so it has a bigger outreach to people and artists on ArtStation. I make sure to add the software experience that I did here, or the software used on this project, which was Photoshop, Maya, Substance Painter, ZBrush, and Sketchfab. I just add digital 3D. Fantasy and game art is the main focus of this project. And then after that, I add a little bio to it, and this is officially, oh, I thought I was going to bring me back to the page, but this is officially just explaining my process of my project. So here I explained that it was an on and off project that I did while I was juggling school. I began the process in December and I ended around early May, so this was roughly around 5 months. There was some things that I explained that I was very proud of learning, like texturing. And then I explained again, harping on the critiques. Any critiques are welcomed, and I gave credit again to the concept artist. So after finishing up my presentation shot and setting up my ArtStation link and publishing my ArtStation link, as well as any of my GIFs on Twitter, Facebook, and any of my Discord servers that I was part of, I finished the project. So that is the end of my breakdown video. I know that I said a lot throughout these videos and I harped on a lot of things like critiques and writing stuff down and making sure that you are following through all your pieces in your project, but these are things that were able to allow me to grow as an artist, learn a lot about doing stylized in ZBrush and Substance Painter, and being able to learn from my mistakes that I did throughout this project, because I did do mistakes throughout these projects, and I think it's important for you guys to know that, because, you know, not everything goes exactly the way that you want it to, and that's okay. You just learn from it and you apply those experiences to other projects that you have. I would love to give a huge thank you and shout out to Stylized Station. They ended up helping me out a lot through this project without them even knowing. Them being able to show off artists helped me find the concept art that I wanted. It helped me find tutorials for this project to learn and base my textures off of. So thank you to them for giving me this opportunity to do a breakdown video for their channel, as well as thanking the concept artist for creating such amazing work for me to base my project off of. I was very passionate about it, and I want to thank them for giving me such beautiful artwork. And the last are all the artists, lab instructors, and teachers who took the time to critique my work. Again, the word critique, but it did help me grow as an artist, and I'm very grateful for the help that they gave me. So I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and I hope these breakdown videos gave you a better insight on how to approach a stylized prop.